But if I were a resident of Boulder, I will tell my friends to keep your babies close to you. There's someone out there.
On January 1st, 1997, Boulder Police detectives Steve Thomas, Ron Gosage, Tom Trujllo, Jane Harmer, and their Sergeant Larry Mason were on their way to Atlanta. It had been 7 days since JonBenet Ramsey was found deceased in the basement of a sprawling, labyrinthian home in one of the city's nicer neighborhoods, and the police had very little to go on even after a full week of ceaseless investigation. Though they were firing on all cylinders, interviewing neighbors, friends, employees, and even at this point potential suspects, one very big question loomed over the whole case. Who were John and Patsy Ramsey, and what did they actually know about the night in question? Despite multiple attempts to secure an interview with the grieving parents, something always came up to prevent that step from being taken. First, the Ramseys were too shaken up, then Patsy was too medicated, and not long after that, they left town to bury JonBenet in the same plot as her older sister. And for that reason, it came as something of a surprise when John and Patsy appeared on CNN that New Year's Day. At 4:34 p.m., anchor Natalie Allen welcomed correspondent Brian Cabell onto the program, informing audiences that earlier that day, he'd conducted an extensive interview with the child's parents. And before getting into the interview footage, Cabell explained that the Ramseys had told him that they were going to be putting together their own investigative team, something that was not meant as any disrespect for the Colorado authorities. They simply wanted the best mind possible looking into the crime. And they'd also told the reporter that they were considering offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of JonBenet's killer starting the following week. With that, and the note that they'd spoken for about 45 minutes, the tape of that interview rolled. Brian began by asking the parents why they'd chosen to speak to the media now, to which John responded by explaining that we have been pretty isolated, totally isolated, for the last 5 days, but that they sense from their friends that this tragedy has touched not just ourselves and our friends, but many people. He then explained that for our grief to resolve itself, we now have to find out why this happened. Cabell then pointed out that there has been some question as to why you hired a defense attorney, and John replied by contradicting his previous statement. I know, he said. Well, we were fortunate from almost the moment that we found the note to be surrounded by friends, our minister, that was Father Holverstock, our family doctor, Dr. Boaf, and a personal friend of mine who is also an attorney, Mike Bynum. And we relied on their guidance almost from that moment on, and my friend suggested that it would be foolish not to have knowledgeable counsel to help both us and with the investigation. Now, it may seem weak to call that a contradiction, but the fact is that John and Patsy Ramsey were surrounded by friends and family since the literal moment that JonBenet was reported missing. Patsy called Fleet and Priscilla White, as well as John and Barbara Fernie, as soon as she'd finished her 911 call at 5:52 a.m. on December 26, 1996. Both couples arrived within the half hour, and the Ramseys spent that night with the Fernies. John, Andrew, and Melinda Ramsey were in town by the early afternoon, and Patsy's sisters weren't far behind. And all of these family members were present in Boulder until the Ramseys left for Atlanta on the 29th, and they, along with the Whites and the Fernies, traveled to Georgia for the funeral. As far as the CNN interview was concerned, however, Patsy had not remained silent either, despite being under the influence of sedatives. In response to the first question, she'd expressed that they had been overwhelmed by the cards and letters and visits and people we haven't seen for years who have come to call and be supportive. A statement which, despite being delivered immediately after John said they were isolated, clearly showed that they had not been alone during this time of grief. Following John's response to the lawyer issue, she asked that if anyone knows anything, please help us. For the safety of all the children, we have to find out who did this. Not because we're angry, John interjected, but because we have got to go on. And as the detectives watched the interview unfold, they were puzzled by that moment. How could they not be angry, and how could they just want to get on with their lives? It was also odd that Patsy was telling people that the killer needed to be found for the safety of all children, considering the ransom note had specified John as the target and that this was based on his business associations with the US government. If the note were legitimate, then there was no reason for anyone not named Ramsey to be concerned. Cabell didn't press that issue, but instead followed up with a gentle probe of a question, asking the couple if they were fully convinced that their daughter was kidnapped by some outsiders outside the family or the circle of close friends. John initially said yes, but then backtracked, saying, we don't, it's just so hard to know, but our family is a loving family. It's a gentle family. We have lost one child. We know how precious their lives are. Cabell neglected to follow up on that stumbling non-answer, however, instead moving on to the ransom note. "Mrs. Ramsey," he began, "you found the note. Was it a handwritten note? 3 pages?" The simple answer would have been yes, but that's not what Patsy said. First explaining that she couldn't read the whole thing, she went on to talk about the morning as a whole. "I had just gotten up," she said. It was the day after Christmas, and we were going to go visiting, and it was quite early in the morning, and I had got dressed and was on my way to the kitchen to make some coffee, and we have a back staircase from the bedroom areas, and I always come down that staircase, and I am usually the first one down. And the note was lying across the 3 pages across the run of the stair treads, and it was kind of dimly lit. It was just very early in the morning, and I started to read it, and it was addressed to John. It said, "Mr. Ramsey," and it said, "We have your daughter." And I just wasn't registering. And I may have gotten through another sentence. "We have your daughter," and I don't know if I got any further than that. I immediately ran back upstairs and pushed open her door, and she was not in her bed, and I screamed for John. Once again, that didn't really line up with what the police knew to be true. On December 26th, Detective Patterson had interviewed Burke Ramsey, the 9-year-old son of John and Patsy, for about 40 minutes. And during that conversation, while Burke was explaining what he and the family had done on Christmas morning, he said, "We went down the wooden stairs. Clearly the staircase at the front of the house, which led directly from the first floor to John and Patsy's 3rd floor bedroom." Now the detective seized on that and gently asked Burke, "Which way do you normally go up and down?" Or your parents, "Which way do they normally go up and down the stairs?" And Burke told Patterson that he wasn't sure because he was at school during the day. So Patterson reframed the question and asked Burke which stairs they used when he was home, to which Burke responded, "Well, I'd say the wooden stairs that we went down for Christmas morning." Pressing further, Patterson asked, "Who uses the circular staircase by the laundry room?" And according to Burke, it was usually just him and his friends because that was the quickest way up to the playroom. And finally, the detective brought it back around, asking, "Do your parents use those stairs often?" According to Burke, he had never seen John or Patsy use them. Now, Brian Cabell couldn't possibly have known about that contradiction, or that Patsy had initially told police that she checked on JonBenet first and found the note second. So he just moved along with the chronology. "John," he began, "you subsequently read the note. Was there anything in there that struck you in any sense?" John replied that there wasn't, and that he'd read the note very quickly. "It said don't call police, that type of thing," he continued, "and I told Patsy to call the police immediately." Now what he didn't tell Cabell, but what the police knew, was that the note said a lot more than that. You see, after explaining how much money John was to withdraw, and in what denominations to withdraw it, the supposed kidnapper had explicitly stated that any deviation of my instructions will result in the immediate execution of your daughter, and that the Ramseys would also be denied her remains for proper burial. Then, in no uncertain terms, the representative of the small foreign faction, which supposedly respected his business but not the country that it serves, went on to outline what would happen if John went to the police, or anyone else for that matter. If John went to the police or the FBI, JonBenet would be beheaded. "If we catch you talking to a stray dog, she dies," they continued. "If you alert bank authorities, she dies. If the money is in any way marked or tampered with, she dies." So, despite all of that, John's plan of action was to use the phone, which was by far the easiest to wiretap, to call the police phone number that is the easiest to monitor. That was an odd decision because John could have used his cell phone to call someone else and then have them call the authorities, but instead he had his wife use the landline. And while one can understand that decision, because in a panicked moment the Ramseys might have thought that they had no other option, what didn't make sense was that they then decided to call 2 sets of family friends, despite the note saying that her child would be beheaded if she spoke to so much as a stray dog. But for an audience who wasn't aware of the details of the note, the decision to call the police made total sense. To the officers investigating the case, however, these decisions seemed very peculiar. But Brian Cabell didn't know that any of that was in the note, so he let John and Patsy keep talking. Patsy said that they went to check on Burke, and John added that JonBenet sometimes slept in his room. Cabell quickly moved the discussion along to later in the day, likely unaware of the details of the time frame between the 911 call and the discovery of the body. The reporter then asked how it came to be that John went looking for his daughter in the basement, and John responded that they'd waited until after the time the call was supposed to have been made, at which point one of the detectives asked me and my friend who was there to go through every inch of the house to see if there was anything unusual or abnormal that looked out of place. Cabell didn't pick up on the line about a friend being there, nor did he press John about why non-family members were inside of an active crime scene. Instead, he allowed John to describe how they started in the basement, and while they were looking, John opened a door. There were no windows in that room, he said, and I turned the light on and he paused. That was her. Patsy then began to speak, saying she was, only for CNN to cut the tape so that they could go to commercial. Before they went to the advertisers, however, Brian Cabell explained to the anchors that Mr. Ramsey did confirm that duct tape was found on his daughter's mouth. I asked him about a cord found around her neck. That was a report out of Colorado today. He said he didn't see it. It could have been there, but he was panicked at that point. He picked up the body, ran screaming upstairs, hoping she was still alive, and of course she was not. Then, prepping the audience for what else was about to come, he said that they would address the question of their being suspects themselves. And because CNN thought that this was an appropriate time to cut to commercial, we're just going to do the same thing. And also, I will address the fact that in this episode, you may have noticed, as compared to the previous three, I've been a little bit more direct in pointing out the inconsistencies regarding things that the Ramseys said, and in my opinion, this interview stinks. Like, it smells bad. It smells rotten, like something's wrong. And you know what else stinks? Frankly, a lot of us. You know, you, Aiden, me, we've all smelled bad at some point in our lives. And that's why we decided to tell you about today's sponsor, Mando. Now, I don't know about you guys, but over the years, I've tried a number of deodorants. Unfortunately, I came of age during the time period when a certain brand was everywhere, and we were mostly using it to create, like, spray bombs that we threw into each other's bathrooms. But since becoming an adult, it's been kind of a struggle at times. Not everything works right, and sometimes you find a scent that you really love, but it doesn't last, and you end up just smelling all over again. And I gotta say, for me, that's been the biggest problem, finding a deodorant that I put on and it still is working 6 hours later. But with Mando, I don't really have to worry about that because it's got a 72-hour odor control. And when I say it's got odor control, I mean that Mando is clinically proven to control odor better than a shower with soap alone. And another great thing is that Mando is actually a high-performance whole-body deodorant that you can apply everywhere. Your pits, the bottom of your feet, other sensitive areas that might smell bad. And that long-lasting whole-body odor control comes in 4 different scents that are all unique from one another. My personal favorite being the bourbon leather, but there's also Clover Woods, Mount Fuji, and Pro Sport. And if you prefer to just be odorless, then there is an unscented version. And if you're wondering how a deodorant can offer all of that while also being skin-safe, baking soda-free, cruelty-free, vegan, pH-optimized to use anywhere on your body, and paraben-free, it's because Mando was created by a doctor who saw firsthand how normal BO was being misdiagnosed and mistreated. Now, what does that mean? It means that Mando, unlike certain traditional deodorants, which try to mask odor with a fragrance and often have aluminum, which Mando does not, Mando is formulated and powered by mandelic acid to stop odor before it starts. So it's more like a pre-deodorant. It reduces odor all day and continues controlling BO for 72 hours. Also, they have wipes. Like, just if you really quickly need to hit that, like, you know, you're in the bathroom, you don't have your stick on you, you can keep these guys. Keep them in your pocket, in your girlfriend's purse, your purse. And aside from the wipes, it's really nice that you get all these different options. I've got wipes, I've got a spray, I've got actual stick deodorant. This is my primary one that I use. This is an acidified body wash that's actually, you know, for the shower. So you can kind of use this in tandem with your regular body wash, and then it'll help control odor even better. And there's also just a deodorant cream, which for certain things is a little bit easier than a stick or a spray. So if you'd like to start treating your body odor in a way that's meant to actually eliminate it rather than mask it, Mando's starter pack bundle is a great deal for new customers. It comes with a full-size stick of deodorant, a cream deodorant tube, a spray deodorant, and then these other two free guys, which are the wipes and the mini body wash. Or there's other stuff you might get, but these are what I got. You'll also get free US shipping, and just for our subscribers, Mando is offering an extra $5 off when you click the link in the description below and enter code LORELodge at checkout. So that's a deal of over 40% off. If you'd like to get all those deals, you can use the link in our description or the pinned comment, or you can also find Mando at stores like Target and Walmart. Now, of course, I gotta say, Mando is awesome, but not even Mando is strong enough for the stink coming off of this interview. When they returned from the commercial break, CNN anchor Lou Walters welcomed viewers back before co-anchor Natalie Allen threw everything back to Cabell. Cabell then explained that in cases like this, it's very normal police procedure to look at the family first of all as possible suspects in this case, and that the Ramseys say they understand this and were well aware of the Susan Smith case a couple of years ago. The reference case involved a woman who reported her 1- and 3-year-old sons missing at the end of October 1994, telling police that a black man had carjacked her and kidnapped her children. She confessed 9 days after making the report, admitting that she had actually rolled her car into a lake with the boys trapped inside. But that's another story for another time, because after he explained this, the taped interview began to play once more, though not from where it had left off. After pointing out that the parents had been asked to supply hair and writing samples, Cabell asked John and a still very sedated Patsy if anyone else was asked. John answered, well, Patsy and I, Burke, our son who is 9, every family member. To which Cabell replied, including your 2 elder children? John confirmed that, but said that he didn't know if any friends had been asked. The parents were then asked if they'd given the samples, and Cabell was somewhat surprised when they said yes, because, according to him, the word was that they thought you were too grief-stricken. So both of you gave samples. After John once again gave an affirmative answer, Cabell asked if they were offended by the request, with John saying no. From there, Cabell moved the conversation to the topic of the killer, prompting the Ramseys to clarify whether or not they believed it was someone outside of their home. Patsy immediately answered, there is a killer on the loose, and John followed with absolutely. Patsy then continued, telling Cabell, I don't know who it is, I don't know if it's a he or a she, but if I were a resident of Boulder, I would tell my friends to keep your babies close to you. There's someone out there. And Cabell responded by pointing out that an FBI spokesman was quoted as saying they don't necessarily regard it as a kidnapping, and asking if the Ramseys felt that that was a wrong assumption. John told the reporter that he didn't know for sure, but there is a note that said, your daughter has been kidnapped, we have your daughter, we want money, you give us the money, she'll be safely returned. And Patsy assented, saying that it seemed like a kidnapping to her, and John followed with, I guess that's what concerns me, because if we don't have the full resources of all the law enforcement community on this case, I'm going to be very upset. Now, these statements raised investigative eyebrows as well. The public didn't know it, but as the Ramseys sat in front of CNN, their lawyers were blocking the Boulder Police and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation from testing evidence. And not only that, but the DA's office was helping them to do it, even though FBI agent Ron Walker, who was on the scene the day of the murder, had told police directly that they should consider the parents as suspects. Now, to Cabell's credit, there is no way he could possibly have known about that. Now, the other issue is that the ransom note they'd just used as evidence that JonBenet was the victim of a botched kidnapping, that the FBI was wrong to say that it wasn't that kind of crime, specified John Ramsey as a target for the sole reason that his business served the US government. So if that was the case, then why did anyone not named John Ramsey, or at least anyone who didn't work for Access Graphics, need to be concerned? The Ramseys were simultaneously arguing that they'd been the victims of a politically motivated terrorist attack by a small foreign faction, and that the perpetrator was some random crazed killer roaming the streets of Boulder. Either the note was legitimate and it was a kidnapping, or it wasn't, and this was just a homicide. But unfortunately, Cabell did not press them on the contradiction. Instead, he remarked that, inevitably, speculation on talk shows will focus on you. It's gotta be sickening. At which point John interjected that it's nauseating beyond belief. And Patsy then expressed how America has just been hurt so deeply with the tragic things that have happened, mentioning the young woman who drove her children into the water, and how we don't know what happened with O.J. Simpson. In her words, America is suffering because we have lost faith in the American family. And Patsy then appealed to faith, emphasizing that they were a Christian, God-fearing family, who loved their children and would do anything for them. But were they? Just before Christmas, the Ramsey family's housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh, had requested a $2,000 loan to cover some necessities. The Ramseys, who were worth $6 million, agreed, but only on the condition that the loan be paid back in $200 increments due each week. A truly Christian family, and especially one worth $6 million, should have been aware of biblical passages like Luke 12:13 through 21, or verses like Mark 10:25, both of which encourage charity and almsgiving of those with excess wealth, especially towards those in their community who need it. A truly Christian family worth $6 million would therefore have given their low-income housekeeper a holiday bonus to cover rent, car repairs, and dental work. But instead, Patsy agreed to a loan with an aggressive 10% per week repayment rate. In the book JonBenet Inside the Ramsey Investigation by Detective Steve Thomas, the author points out that in detective work, it was always a red flag when someone proclaimed innocence by repeated religious affirmations. It's an even bigger red flag when their actions don't match those affirmations. But Brian Cabell didn't know about any of that, so he didn't press. And with that, the aired portion of the interview came to its last point as Cabell asked, "Do you truly think the perpetrator will be found?" John said yes, and after further prompting expressed that in his heart, he felt that it was a single individual, even though the ransom note he was leaning on to discredit the FBI's opinion said that it was a group. And the last thing that Patsy did in the interview was say that JonBenet would never have to know the loss of a child, that she would never have to know cancer or the death of a child. And after that, the feed cut back to the studio, where Brian Cabell told the anchors that the Ramseys said when they go back, they will sit down with the Boulder Police and tell them everything they want to know. That came as good news to us, writes Detective Thomas, because we were on the way to Atlanta, where they were sitting in a television studio. Maybe we were reading them all wrong. It sounded as if all we had to do in Georgia was knock on their door and get those interviews. After all, the Ramseys had been informed that the detectives were on their way to Atlanta, as had the Atlanta Police Department. So if the Ramseys were sincere, the conversation wouldn't have to wait. But by the time the Boulder investigators arrived, the Ramseys were on a plane, headed for points unknown. Though the Ramseys were certainly being viewed with a healthy, FBI-endorsed degree of skepticism, the investigators weren't necessarily in Atlanta to build a case against the couple. Boulder's detectives were there for two primary reasons. One was to learn who John and Patsy were as people, and the other to hunt for a name from the past, someone with a grudge, perhaps an enemy capable of negotiating that big confusing house in Boulder and killing JonBenet. Unable to secure an interview with the elusive parents, the police were attempting to build a historical file the hard way, through talking to their friends and family members, and shortly after John and Patsy Ramsey spoke with CNN on New Year's Day 1997, their friends John and Barbara Fernie were sitting with Boulder Police detectives for an interview of their own. The couple were, like the Whites, two of the first people to be called to the Ramsey home on that tragic December morning. According to investigator James Kohler in Foreign Faction, the Fernies arrived by the way of the back alley and had approached the rear kitchen door, and from there proceeded around to the front of the house where they joined the company of two uniformed officers and the Whites at the street side entrance to the home. They were then directed inside to the sunroom, where later that morning he and others were shown a copy of the ransom note and asked their thoughts about its contents. Fernie told detectives that he thought the note was very personal and written in a condescending manner towards John Ramsey, but something about it seemed off. In his opinion, the note just didn't really make any sense and seemed to contain some kind of fakey stuff. Beyond that, the couple shared several observations about the morning. John Fernie recalled that someone, probably John Ramsey, said that he had checked all of the doors to the home the previous evening and that all of them were not just securely locked, but deadbolted. And police reports from that morning confirmed that John Ramsey had in fact said this. He'd also checked the doors that morning, finding that all of them remained locked. And this interested Fernie because at one point during the morning, he felt a draft coming in from somewhere in the house. He made a sweep and ascertained that the door on the north side of the house by the butler pantry was standing open, and he then shut it. That was a possible contradiction with what John Ramsey had said, but on the other hand, according to Officer Rick French's police report, the responding officer himself personally checked all doors to the home, finding them closed and securely locked, which is something that he and John Ramsey agreed upon on that day. So, the door that Fernie had found open must have been opened after the police arrived. But Barb Fernie shared a concern of her own. According to Kohler, she told investigators that Patsy Ramsey had told her on the morning of December 26th that she had just given the ransom note to John after finding it on the spiral staircase. Now, that entire morning, up until John went to get Burke and sent him off to the White's house, Barb Fernie had been confused regarding that boy's whereabouts. She understood that Burke typically woke up around 5:30, and yet he was nowhere to be seen over an hour later, and with quite a commotion going on downstairs. That morning, the Ramseys told everyone, including police, that their son had not yet woken up. So when Patsy told CNN that she had screamed for John from outside of JonBenet's second-floor room, Barb realized that something didn't seem right. While Burke sleeping in after a relatively late night was certainly a possibility, it struck her as very unlikely that he would not wake up if he heard his mother screaming from the other side of the same floor, and especially if John could hear her from his third-floor bedroom. It was a good question, and one that would come up again and again throughout the following months of the investigation. The following day, the detective team got to work in earnest, and for detectives Thomas and Trujllo, the first stop was Peachtree Presbyterian Church. It was where John and Patsy tied the knot on November 5th, 1980. It was where they buried John's eldest daughter, Beth, in 1992. And as of December 31st, 1996, it also became the final resting place of JonBenet Ramsey. And on the morning of January 2nd, 1997, detectives Thomas and Trujllo were there to speak with the man who had been there for all of it, the Reverend Dr. Frank Harrington. If anyone knew the souls of these people, it would be the man responsible for them. But Reverend Harrington wasn't forthcoming. "I'm not sure I want to talk with you," the minister told the detectives. And then, unprompted, he told them he would share no privileged information. Now, Thomas knew what he meant, that much like doctors and lawyers, most information shared in confidence with a member of the clergy can, with some exceptions, be legally withheld from the police. But it was still an interesting statement, considering that they hadn't actually asked yet. And that prompted Thomas to ask the obvious question: is there privileged information? Harrington said that he wouldn't answer that either, and then asked if he'd need an attorney. And though Thomas and Trujllo assured him that he was not a suspect, the Reverend decided that he would feel more comfortable with a lawyer and a witness present, so any inquiries would have to wait until after those two roles were filled. 10 minutes later they were, and the questions could begin. But unfortunately, the brief exchange yielded little information. Though Harrington was by no means legally obligated to tell them anything, it did bother the detectives that a man of God would reach for a lawyer rather than voluntarily give police everything he could to solve the terrible murder of a child, particularly if he wasn't violating the sanctity of confession. The next stop on the itinerary was the funeral home, where Thomas and Trujllo learned that there were no suspicious visitors during the viewing. No one seemed out of place. It was just hundreds of people paying their respects to a dead child. But the investigators were most interested in the Ramseys' behavior, specifically if they had been curious about how their daughter's injuries had been hidden. According to the assistant director, they never asked. One of the more revealing interviews came with a visit to the home of Don and Nedra Paw, Patsy's elderly mother and father. And according to Detective Thomas, Nedra seemed obsessed with pageants. One room in the Paw home, he said, was a shrine to beauty pageants, filled with pictures and articles and with trophies and crowns worn by Patsy and Pam. And though the detectives were trying to keep the conversation on the topic of JonBenet, Nedra kept driving the conversation back towards pageantry. She told us that JonBenet had started on the runways at the age of 4 for exactly the same reason children begin training for the Olympics at an early age, writes Thomas. Nedra's reason being that if you don't start them young, they fall miserably behind. They were eventually able to get her off the topic, and from that point on, Nedra was generally very open. She agreed with the majority of Ramsey associates that no stranger could have navigated that maze of a house, going so far as to say that you couldn't find the basement in that house if you didn't know where it was. You know it was down, but which door would you go through to find it? There's a lot of doors that look like a basement door in that house. For the investigators, this was yet another point against the perpetrator being a stranger. Everyone seemed to be on the same page that the killer must have been familiar with the home's layout. One spot where they did run into some trouble was the issue of JonBenet's bedwetting habit. Nedra was chatty about almost everything else, but became evasive about that particular topic, and the detectives made a mental note to follow up on that. Regarding John's decision to hire his own legal and investigative team, she told Thomas and Trujllo, "It's not that you folks in Boulder aren't doing a good job and can't resolve this, but it's my understanding that there's never been a kidnapping in Boulder. So, if you've never been on a kidnapping before, you need great minds who have done this before." And she wasn't incorrect about the lack of experience within the Boulder PD. They had no dedicated homicide detectives, and they were inexperienced with kidnappings of this kind. But that didn't mean they were bad detectives. Thomas showed just that when he asked Nedra what JonBenet would do if awakened suddenly. Nedra explained that she didn't like being pulled out of bed, and that she would scream bloody murder if she was. The grandmother then followed that up with the remark that unless they chloroformed her or taped her mouth, she would have screamed like you wouldn't believe. There certainly wasn't chloroform found at the scene, or in JonBenet's system, or on JonBenet at all, but there had been tape, so it was now a question of when that tape had been applied. When the conversation steered to the topic of potential suspects, and in particular the initials SBTC from the ransom note, Nedra was quick to offer up that son of a bitch Tom Carson. In 1997, Carson was the chief financial officer at Access Graphics, and apparently he'd been responsible for getting Nedra fired from a position she too held at John's company. As had John and Patsy Ramsey, she also suggested that Jeff Merrick and Linda Hoffman Pugh could be responsible, as well as a handyman, a painter, the gardener, the nanny, and a couple of neighborhood kids. And then, somewhat unexpectedly, really very unexpectedly, she named Fleet and Priscilla White, a couple who had been amongst the very first people called on the morning that JonBenet was reported missing, just minutes after Patsy called the police. They'd stuck by the Ramseys that entire day, Burke had spent most of that morning and afternoon at their house, and Fleet White had even been with John when the man found his daughter's lifeless body in that dark windowless room. So why on earth would they point the finger at him? The answer lay with an incident that transpired shortly after JonBenet's funeral on New Year's Eve. As the Paws and others would explain over the course of the detectives' time in Atlanta, the Whites were not particularly pleased with how John and Patsy were handling the investigation. The couple had been staying with John's brother Jeff, and at some point he overheard them discussing a plan to speak with John and Patsy about their lack of cooperation with the authorities. Jeff gave his brother a heads up, and for some reason all hell broke loose. From what the detectives were able to gather, emotions were running high, and some of the Ramsey Paw clan grew afraid, and one of Patsy's sisters thought the Whites were coming to kill them all. It was unclear how they came to that conclusion, as there was no evidence that the Whites had even been angry prior to arriving at the Paw residence. Despite that, Don Paw even ended up loading not one, but 2 pistols and placing them underneath a couch cushion. Thankfully, John Ramsey was able to eventually calm everyone down by saying that Fleet was his friend and would not harm anyone. Family friend and financial advisor Ron Westmoreland tried to help de-escalate the situation and asked Don Paw to put the guns away, but it's unclear if he actually did. Don said that he had, but Nedra thought that he hadn't. When the Whites did arrive, the extended Ramsey family characterized him as waving his big hands about, speaking excitedly, and following Ramsey around the room in what they considered to be a confrontational manner. Fleet expressed that he and other friends of the family were chagrined that he seemed to be avoiding the cops. He felt as though John's attorneys were giving them bad advice, and that their reluctance to speak with police was only causing the public to view them with suspicion. The Whites would ultimately choose to book their own flight home instead of taking the Ramseys' plane, and the police planned to get their side of the story when they got back to Boulder. When the investigators wrapped up their conversation with the Paws, they left the house to a sea of reporters. Thomas gave one brief statement that they were in Atlanta merely as part of conducting a full investigation, not to serve warrants or make arrests, but the reporters were unconvinced. Now, while it's unclear exactly what day this interview occurred, Thomas and Trujillo also paid a visit to the Marietta, Georgia home of John Ramsey's ex-wife, Lucinda Johnson, mother of John's eldest 3 children, Melissa, John Andrew, and the late Beth Ramsey. She, too, requested the presence of a witness prior to speaking with detectives, and she still wasn't particularly cooperative once that person arrived. She did tell them that she and John had married on July 16, 1966 in Kalamazoo, Michigan. She'd been with him through his time in the Navy, the beginning of his business career, and the birth of their 3 children, but all of that came crashing down when she discovered that John was having an affair during the 1970s. They separated for a time, and then divorced on February 24, 1978. Lucinda was awarded physical custody, while John received generous visitation rights. He also paid $800 per month in child support and alimony, as well as college expenses for all 3 children. They split the estate down the middle and went their separate ways, only for John's father to marry Lucinda's mother several years later. And partially as a result, Lucinda remained a part of the Ramsey family in a greater way than an ex-wife typically would, and even worked with Patsy to guide Beth through Atlanta's debutante scene. It was an odd arrangement, but it seemed to work for them, with Lucinda even visiting the Ramsey family's Boulder home. Still, despite the ostensibly amicable split, the fact that the marriage had ended over an affair was certainly relevant information. A jilted ex-lover, be it the wife or the other woman, could be considered a person with a motive to harm John or his family. Naturally, the investigators wanted to know who she was. "I don't recall her name," came the rather surprising reply, and Thomas struggled to understand how any scorned ex-wife could ever forget the name of the other woman who broke up her marriage. So the detectives got the feeling that she may know more than she was letting on, and that perhaps there was room for a bit of future bargaining considering the fact that John, Andrew, and Melissa had not yet been cleared by police. And though they would never have withheld such a finding, they might be able to leverage Lucinda's desire to see her children cleared of suspicion into getting the information they wanted regarding John's former mistress. The detectives also spent some time canvassing the neighborhood around Northridge Drive, where John and Patsy had lived before their move to Colorado. For the most part, nothing came of it, but a visit to a woman by the name of Vesta Taylor, who lived across the street from the Ramseys for a decade, revealed an interesting lead. While living in Atlanta, Patsy and John were part of a group who called themselves the Lunch Bunch, and these were 10 couples who Thomas understood were among John and Patsy's oldest friends. These were doctors, lawyers, accountants, and other such members of Atlanta's professional class. And detectives hoped that they could be the key to understanding who might be responsible for the ever more confusing murder of JonBenet Ramsey. It would, unfortunately, take several months to interview all of them, and at this point, the detectives had to get back to Colorado. It seemed their ship had sprung a leak. But who was responsible for those leaks and the fallout of attempting to identify that person is a story for the next episode of this series. This case is by far the most convoluted thing I've ever looked into, and we're still only like 9 days into the investigation as it happened. There's going to be more interviews to look at. There's going to be a whole bunch of conflict between the DA's office and the Boulder PD. There's Ramsey family attorneys trying to do things that they have zero power to do. There are police tripping over each other trying to figure out who the leaker is. And it's going to be a while, to be honest. We're going to have a lot of episodes on this series. I can't tell you exactly what'll be in the next one because to be perfectly honest, as my videographer and producer and best friend here knows, I have yet to have a video go over the stuff I expected to go over. I expected the first video to take us through, at the very least, the end of December, and it took us 3 videos to get through 5 days. So for those of you still sticking with us here, I genuinely appreciate it so very much. And I hope that we are able to shed light on some of the reason that this case is still a mystery almost 3 decades later, and why nobody's ever been arrested, and why there are two very entrenched camps on this, that there is the intruder did it and the Ramseys did it. Why after all this time? I mean, there aren't many cases that are this strange. So, if you're still sticking with us to this, I appreciate it, and I hope you will follow through on the rest of the series, because we can really only continue doing the series if people continue watching it. So, those views, those shares, if you like the video, all of those things, if you hit the notification bell and subscribe to the channel, obviously, those all help us to continue doing this work. But if you'd like to support us a little bit more directly, there are a number of ways you can do that. First of all, if you have Discord, I would recommend joining our community over there at bit.ly/jointhelodge. That's where all of our updates go first. That is where we interact with our followers at times when we have the time to do so. And it's, we've actually been using it to help source information. If there's something that I don't necessarily have time to go look for, I can ask people, hey, can anybody help me find this source? And then I can review it once it's there. We are literally crowdsourcing true crime investigations. And it's not just true crime, it's also the paranormal, the unsolved, the urban legends, the conspiracy theories, all of that stuff that you see here on this channel. But if you're thinking more, you want to give us some money, we would appreciate that, and there are ways you can do it. You can go to Patreon, that's the most direct way. A subscription is $1 a month, and it gets you access to a few different exclusive pieces of content, such as Liquored Lore, which is the flagship one, where we have a few drinks and talk about lore. What that lore is really depends on how many drinks we have. The most recent one as of filming this video is with Stephen Bell of History of Everything and Stukui, and oh boy. The other ways to support us are by going to bunkerbranding.com and wearing the lodge by going to the Lore Lodge section and purchasing one of our t-shirt designs or our hoodies. They are made in America, they are very high quality, and they are oh so cozy. You could also drink the lodge by going to tableauroastingco.com and buying Mount Pocono Perk, our coffee that I designed myself. I did not pick it off of a shelf. I told Matt Moore, hey, I want these things, and he gave me those things. You can also get Stephen Bell's History of Everything. You get his coffee too. We work very closely with those guys. If you're looking for more Lodge, well, you can go check out History Unhinged, our brand new show that we once again do with Stephen Bell of Stukui and History of Everything. If you haven't noticed, this is a really close partnership. And that show is basically 4 guys, 2 of whom are professional historians, 1 is an amateur historian, and then 1 is Aidan Thornbury. He's there to be you, so that if we get too into the weeds, he can bring us back to a place that makes sense to the common viewer. He's gonna come say hello.
I know some history. Not a lot.
It's mostly about ships and trains.
He's not lying to you.
Yeah, it's okay. We also have the Weird Bible podcast that is with Wendigoon, and we are bringing a new roundtable show to that where I will sit down with priests and reverends and ministers of various different faith traditions in the Christian faith and ask them questions about what their sect believes about a certain thing and try and understand the differences between various Christian traditions. I said tradition a lot there, and faith a lot there. I'll try to be better next time. There's also my channel, which if I have time, then probably right after this video goes live, within an hour or two, I will be streaming on. It's Aiden Mattis, and it's usually a gaming stream on Fridays. We play a lot of Helldivers, but we're also looking at doing some Holdfasts, some Hell Let Loose, maybe some Warzone if that ever becomes playable again. We also have two other channels that we are currently reworking a little bit. Those are Boozy Mixologist and Off the Record. These are shows about, as you might expect, mixology and music. If you want to help us to get those actually moving along, and if you find those topics to be interesting, then you can go ahead and subscribe to those, check out the videos that are already posted, and help us get to monetized status so that we can, explain to our money people why that makes sense. Our money people are my little sister, and she yells at me when I make bad financial decisions. And of course, there is our live show, The Lore Lads. That is every Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, unless it's not, and if it's not, we'll tell you. Most of the time we talk about whatever we had just talked about on Friday in a more discussion format. We have a Q&A and all that, but then sometimes we have guests, sometimes we cover other topics. It just really depends on what's going on. It's a little bit more of a versatile kind of show that doesn't require me sitting down for 4 days and writing a term paper. If you are catching this video when it premieres, then we do have some interesting guests coming up. We have Steve Fisher, and then we also have Seth Rogers and Tony Mathis. All of these people are related to the Sebastian Rogers disappearance that we covered in the summer of 2024. I think that covers just about everything, so if you're still here, you are clearly one of the most loyal. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.